Welcome to Antarctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Allison Cusick is a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, studying biological oceanography with a focus on polar phytoplankton, and holds a master's degree in marine biodiversity and conservation. Prior to her time in graduate school, she spent 10 years as a research biologist conducting research in the fields of neuroscience, immunology, biofuel, genetics, and terrestrial ecology. Even though she was working in a lab full-time, Allison seized every chance she got and any money she'd saved up to participate in voluntourism projects. Her scientific expertise and love of travel have taken her to study exotic ecosystems in the Amazon jungle, the plains of Africa, and the icy glacial bays of Antarctica, just to name a few. Her first expedition to Antarctica took place in 2013, where she lived aboard the US Nathaniel B Palmer for 53 days in the Ross Sea. In an effort to share her current research with others, she developed the Fjord Phyto Antarctic Citizen Science Project in partnership with Dr. Maria Vernet, IATO operators, and a collection of keen expedition guides on board tourism-based ships that were frequenting Antarctica. As lead developer of this citizen science project, Fjord Phyto by Vernet Lab, she hopes travelers can help better our scientific understanding of Antarctic fjord ecosystems and their response to a changing climate. Allison is on the advisory committee of the Polar Citizen Science Collective and also works part-time as a senior research associate at Synthetic Genomics to advance breakthroughs in algal biofuel research. Furthermore, she runs the website womanscientist.com and corresponding Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. Though Allison was born and raised in Seattle, she now lives in sunny San Diego due to her PhD program at Scripps. When not doing science, you can find Allison traveling, camping, scuba diving, ultra-running, cycling, or drinking a good cup of coffee. Of special note, Allison ran a marathon on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica, dressed as a banana, on the same day she boarded the Palmer icebreaker for the 2-month expedition at sea. Allison Cusick, welcome to Antarctic Stories.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to be speaking with you today. Where are you calling in from?
I am currently in Seattle, Washington, which is very warm right now, no rain, despite the rumors.
And my understanding is that you just came back from Antarctica, is that correct?
Yes, I was just in Antarctica for the last 2 months, so as of the beginning of January, so it's been a while.
Wow, yeah, that's a long haul to be down there.
Yeah, it's fun though.
Excellent. Now, obviously, you've got a lot of different projects. You've been involved in a lot of different things over the past few years. Specifically today, I want to ask you about the citizen science project that you've been spearheading in the polar regions. So can you tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, exactly what citizen science is, for those who haven't heard of it before, but also where was the idea of a citizen science program specific to the polar regions born?
Yeah, so the citizen science is just a term to encompass the fact that you have non-scientists helping researchers in science projects, and it also involves a lot of education and engagement. So it needs both components of relevant research and then also engaging communities that might not otherwise be involved in doing science, which is really amazing. It's actually a growing community, Citizen Science Association, all over the world. There's movement for this. And specifically for the polar regions, I had met a woman, a researcher, who had been working for decades in the poles, and she had been contacted. Her name's Maria Vernet. She's my advisor now. And she had been contacted by one of the polar guides, Bob Gilmore, who was just eager to get more involved in science. He's a science nerd himself. And so he was reaching out to a data center in Colorado to be put in touch with anybody who might be interested in working or bringing their science to the ships. And so serendipitously, when I started a master's program, I met her and she told me she had this connection with Bob. And so we elaborated on that to build something that could actually be an activity that comes on board the ships and engages passengers, but also has scientific relevance to answering questions in the Antarctic that we don't have answers to.
I think it's such a genius idea. And actually, I've known Bob for many years. He's been a colleague of mine in Antarctica. And when he first started talking about it with us, with the folks on the team that aren't involved in the science, it was really compelling. It's a really good argument to make, because obviously there's so many people who are like yourself, scientists that are quote unquote back home in the lab or in a university or, like an educational setting, who can't possibly or find it very difficult to get the funding as a researcher to come down and study certain things. And meanwhile, there's all these tourist ships and other types of ships that are regularly going back and forth, from South America down to Antarctica. And why not capitalize on that, right? And collect data.
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely there is a program, you have the British Antarctic Survey, and the US has a long-term ecological research survey, but you get time on a ship to do that 1 month out of every year. And then as a personal researcher, I can't compete to get one of the US icebreakers and monopolize it the whole season. I also have to do stuff back here. So it's almost like Antarctica never had any indigenous people, but the tour ships are like the local knowledge of the area, I feel like, because they're down there for months and months. I think there was a story where my advisor had the collaborative research project going to Anvord Bay, where Nico Harbor is, and they were going to monitor this phytoplankton bloom in April. And they showed up and ran into Bob for other circumstances, and they were like, "We're here to capture this bloom event." And he was like, "Oh yeah, that happened 3 weeks ago." Like, well, we have to do what we can now. So
that's a real bummer. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that just speaks to how valuable it is to have ships that are going down there or have a presence more or less all season that can capture these events, if they happen when not expected, and also unexpected things that are going on, right? Changes in the environment that we couldn't have anticipated that can be captured.
Yeah.
Given that the alternative, I suppose, as a researcher for gathering data in Antarctica, other than getting on a ship, would be to work at a research base. Have you thought about applying for work at Antarctic research bases?
I have thought about applying for work at Antarctic research bases. I think the initial idea you have, as anybody who might be interested in going to Antarctica, is to go as a tourist. But then, because I was in the line of science, you can travel to a lot of amazing places as well as a scientist. So I had looked into how you can be involved in the Antarctic support contract and get on station, and flew myself out to Denver, Colorado for a job fair. The contractor at the time was Raytheon, and you just go around booth to booth. You don't have any specialized skills in doing anything in the polar regions. You're just a general scientist wanting to get access to that world. And there was one gentleman who was like, "You can come in anyway. Like, even if you were to convince somebody you would be the best janitor on station, the energy and the enthusiasm would get you in the door." And I never heard back from anybody. So I was like, well, that didn't work. I don't know how. A lot of people ask, how do you get started in the polar regions? And I have no answer. I have no idea. It's a little bit of luck, a little bit of searching, a little bit of keeping your ears open. So in 2013, just by chance, my boss at the time came to me and said, "I need to go to Antarctica. I've been invited on this collaborative grant, and I don't have the time to go down and be on a ship for 53 days. So you're going to go." And this was my first time out on a ship, on a ship in Antarctica. And I got to go to McMurdo Station.
Wow.
And that's when I really saw first time, like, oh, this is what life would be like on a research base. This is how many different people you need to work down there to operate this whole community, make it function. If you're the firefighter, you might also be the glacial rescue guide. You might also be making cookies. Like, you have to have a lot of skills. So I've yet to work on base, but I definitely would love to at some point.
That's really cool. And you bring up a really good point that someone who hasn't considered this before or thought about it before might not understand what kind of manpower is required to run a base, and also how multi-skilled you need to be, right? And I know a lot of people who come from a science background who ended up being the person who dealt with the garbage at the South Pole Station, for example, because that was the way to get down there. And I have another colleague in the industry who was an expedition leader on ships and then applied to be an air traffic controller, one of the stations down there.
Wow.
I don't remember which one, but it's kind of like, you got to be willing to do anything if you really want to have that experience. And once you're in the door, maybe things are a little bit different, but that's a different world.
Yeah, it definitely is.
So in terms of the citizen science program on the ships, how has the reception been overall by both the companies that you're trying to convince to adopt these programs, but also the actual staff and passengers themselves?
Been received very well, especially by passengers. I think it's still such a novel idea, maybe, that you could find science projects that can be adapted to have passengers participate. And then a lot of the operators, so it's come from both ways. So I've had pitched to, people in a higher level in the operations side of things where they really want it on board, and then they can create a space for that for the guides and the staff to kind of take it on as a full responsibility. And then when they're on board, they have, the pressure's off to have to juggle too many things, because you do need some focus to be able to manage multiple citizen science projects on board. And then it's also come from the ground up. So like people like Bob, who've come and just expressed interest in taking on doing something extra because they miss the science, or they had it in their past, or they want to bring it to the passengers. And so then they'll, take it on. And usually when it's, from my experience now that I've been on board for 2 seasons to be able to operate the project I run and kind of learn more about the logistics of the polar industry, the staff end up falling in love with the projects. The passengers rave about it. We do feedback surveys just to capture like anecdote comments about how they felt. And it was usually one of the highlights. Actually, I had an experience this season where we were going, everybody jokes that nobody's going to care about phytoplankton, but we were out in Wilhelmina Bay and we got a call on the radio that there was a whale nearby. And so the driver and I were like, whale or phytoplankton, what do you guys want to do? And they're like, we had actually had an incredible experience with humpback whales a couple weeks earlier. So they were like, forget the whale, let's go do science. And so for me, that was like, yes, that's amazing.
That's super cool.
Yeah. So I think all around there's been positive response to it.
Yeah, it's funny as well, because I think that people don't get excited about things that they don't know exist, first of all, or that they don't see unless you point it out, right? And there's a lot of really cool things in the polar regions that are so tiny, little life forms, whether it's phytoplankton or salps or whatever, or little like jellyfish or things that you can find. And you're so busy looking at everything else, at these like towering peaks, at the whales, at the penguins, at the icebergs. And then as soon as you have someone like a scientist or an expedition guide point in the water and go, look at that. Look, there's a whole bunch of little, krill or something. Yeah. And then it becomes fascinating, because then all of a sudden the micro universe of the polar regions opens up to you. And knowing that you have a scientist right next to you who can tell you about the importance of that, and you're going to take readings that's going to make a difference at people back home studying it. I mean, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah.
What have been the biggest challenges then in getting tour operators to come on board with these programs? Because obviously there's some expense associated. You have to have reading instruments that need to be bought for, taking readings. And generally speaking, what have been the biggest challenges you've come up against?
The one that I had mentioned too is that that support, if there's a role for a staff member to take on these projects, our tour operators are providing a role like that, which makes the projects then a priority to run on board as part of like the lecture program or outreach program on board. I think it's not the biggest challenge, probably would be the financial side of it, honestly, because some citizen science projects are low barrier to entry. So it's photography based. It doesn't need a lot of startup materials to get going or a lot of training of the staff. The project I run, Fjord Phyto, it's probably one of the more intensive ones, because I have to train some of the guides to do the project, and that ideally would be done in person, just because there's a couple moving parts. But then once you put it into practice, it might only take an hour to do the whole thing, depending on how much you talk and explain what's happening with the project. So in that sense, because I'm providing the equipment and the gear, I'm at a limit to how many operators I can work with, because I don't have gear for enough people who want. There's actually more interest to do the project than I have equipment for providing, which is, as a new scientist in grad school, the one of the things you learn is writing grants. So just incentive to get better at writing grants. And then from their side too, some operators are building science centers on board or have facilities to help provide certain equipment and gear. Some are talking about the idea of building labs on board their ships, which would just facilitate other researchers who might not have a project that's photography based, but other researchers might be able to create projects that can also engage passengers. But they just need a little more kind of traditional lab space, so to speak.
Can you give us an example of citizen science work that is photography based?
Yes, one example would definitely be HappyWhale. That is collecting, it's hard to find the whales and then tag them, and it's somewhat invasive to put satellite tags on whales. So one idea with HappyWhale and multiple photo identification programs is that you have this fingerprint of a whale fluke, and you can identify that whale. Then if it's ever photographed by somebody else somewhere else in the world, then you kind of have that track of where it's been seen elsewhere. So it's definitely less invasive, but also becoming a great tool to track whales migrations.
Right. I've heard some really great stories actually about that project, because the whale, the underside of the fluke on humpbacks is unique to each whale, like a fingerprint.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've heard some really cool stories about whales that have been photographed in Antarctica, and then they've been identified again up along the coast of Argentina or near Australia or whatever. So you start to get these really amazing migration patterns that's from something as simple as getting a picture at the right time when their fluke is showing.
Yeah, definitely.
So on that note, what kind of real impact has the data collected through your program, for example, on tourist ships? What impact has that had on the work of research back on dry land in educational institutions and research institutions?
The project I run is just completed its second season, and I have not yet analyzed the samples that we have collected. There's another graduate student that's helping on the project, and she's looked at the very first year when we just piloted this idea, just with a minimal, take some bottles, take some seawater, see what we find. And through that, we have that potential to track these phytoplankton communities, who's in the community, starting in November all the way through March, how that's changing. And so we can see too, when these blooms are happening, like I had mentioned, the research ships go down depending on the amount of time they captured on the ship, the research ship. But if they miss that window, then they miss the main event that's happening that they're going down for. So we've been able to see when these blooms are happening in the year, but also we can identify, there's a potential that we've identified a species that we haven't been able to find in the literature that's been documented down there. So otherwise you wouldn't have captured that if you came at the wrong time of the season. So when I get back in April to San Diego to Scripps Oceanography, my primary focus is to analyze the samples collected last season and this season.
That's really exciting. So then we're going to have all of your findings available, and that's phenomenal. I mean, and listening to you talk about phytoplankton and phytoplankton blooms, it makes me realize I don't know that much about phytoplankton. So perhaps you could give us sort of the Coles Notes version on what it is, why it's so cool, and what a bloom is.
Yeah. So plankton is just a word derived from Greek that means drifter in the ocean. So it's any organism that doesn't necessarily have a lot of power to move itself outside of its current environment. So in the Antarctic, we also call krill plankton, even though they do have at least large migration patterns throughout the day and night. But they're considered plankton because they're small enough. They get swept away with the currents sometimes. And so then if you have phytoplankton, phyto is just referring to the fact that these little single cell organisms are using sunlight to make their energy. So we refer to them a lot as plant-like, but if you look at their evolution, they're not really plants. So then it gets crazy. And if you start to nerd out on this, you realize you could have cyanobacteria be a phytoplankton, you could have a green algae be a phytoplankton, or you could have this thing called a protist be a phytoplankton. And a protist is literally, if you look it up, it's not fungus, not plant, not animal. So you're like, okay,
Okay.
what is it then? So they're kind of, if you're interested in extraterrestrial life, this is, you might like phytoplankton.
And so what's happening when it's blooming? What makes that a unique event?
Oh, yeah. So basically, when they need light, and then they need basic nutrients like nitrogen, phosphate, silica, iron. So when they get that mix, they will start to grow rapidly. And because they're a single cell, they divide into two. And so then you're just getting this exponential growth. And they'll grow until they become limited in something. Either they're being eaten by other organisms, so they stop kind of expanding and growing, or they run out of a nutrient because they've just consumed it all. And then at that point, that's when we call it a bloom, is they've just reached this high abundance level. Sometimes the water looks like pea soup or gets really green, or if the water changes color, then it's a bloom.
Is that the primary factor in how you identify a bloom if you're going down specifically to study phytoplankton blooms, or are there other indicators that would let you know that one is in process? Or
I think you would have to be tracking it to know when the peak bloom is happening. I should actually know this, but I'm going to give myself a pass for being a new graduate student. So is it something I'm gonna look up?
Fair enough. I'm sorry, I went really tough on the questions there.
Like what number of cells do you need to have in the water to define it's a bloom happening? My gut feeling is it's based on color and density or abundance.
Right. So gut feeling is that it's going to be something you can see with the naked eye then.
Yeah. I might
Okay.
think that. even when we're in the lab and you're growing them in the lab, once you're, it starts off looking like clear water. And then once it starts to look green or brown, then you're like, oh, it's blooming.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. All right. I'm going to shift gears for a second because you're involved in so many different things. And one of the things is that you're a real advocate for women in science, and you post a lot of really great articles and interviews on Women Scientists, your website, womenscientist.com, about women in the polar field. Can you talk a little bit about your inspiration for starting that? And also, if this is something that you know about, how does gender representation in polar science in particular look these days?
Good questions. So I first started the idea for Women Scientists actually because I felt like I was interested, maybe this was just something unique to being in the Seattle region. There's a lot of biotech and there's a lot of more human health focused biology positions and jobs open. And I had been more interested in ecology and in caring about doing research with the environment. I think it was more difficult to get jobs in fish and wildlife and at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration with the US. And so I was trying to find examples of people who were making a life work where they were doing science, but they could be in the field, but maybe there was also a lab component because I really wanted to live in a city. And it was kind of a struggle. It was a struggle to find people that were doing that and making a living with it, because there's also the problem in the wildlife biology with field work is it's very underpaid to no pay to your paying to do it. And it's every season you have to find a new job. And I had done that for 2.5 years and it was just getting too difficult to have a sustainable life. And I didn't know about the polar tourism industry at all back then as a way to still, be involved in field and that's a tangent. So I was posting a lot of my examples from my life of what I had been doing and different jobs I had had and different ways I had been getting that experience for myself. And then I realized instead of, Facebook, people probably don't want to always hear about one thing in somebody's life. They're like, oh, she always talks about this science stuff. Like maybe that would be boring. So I was like, maybe I should just create a website that's a place where I can basically have a platform to share all the science related stories. So if people care about that, they'll go there. And then in my own search, I was finding other women who were doing really cool things. So I wanted to highlight them and as examples. Also, you could do these things without having to go to graduate school. I think there's a lot of people who want to explore and stay in science, but they're not ready or don't. I didn't have a desire to go to grad school for 10 years. I didn't even think I would ever want to go to grad school. To me, it was important to share that. Like there are people doing stuff that don't need to have a master's degree or a PhD to do cool science and travel the world and be in the field and find that life that they like. So that was the inspiration to start Woman Scientist. And then as far as what the gender representation is looking like in the polar regions, I think just in science in general, there's a lot more women who are interested in getting degrees in this line of work. So in the lower levels of student status or post student, it's almost more women than men. But the where it falls out is in the upper leadership roles, where you still have more male dominated representation. But I think that's changing, definitely changing. So a lot of the generation prior to me, they were like the first women to be in these roles. But a lot of my generation now is starting to come up into those ranks. So actually in 2016, I participated in volunteering for this event called the Wiki Bomb. So the idea was that we would find as many women in polar research as possible and then make Wikipedia biography pages for them, and then just bomb Wikipedia with these uploads to kind of raise the profile of women, that even if you're just Googling women in polar research, you'd have more representation coming up. And so that was really successful. We uploaded over 150 biographies. There was a huge team on this. I was just a volunteer, but it was led by a group in Australia. And it was definitely inspirational. And then you start to find one, and then you realize there's so many more. And you're like, how do we capture everybody?
For sure. There's so many, but nobody's ever bothered to actually count them or showcase them or celebrate them in any way, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really exciting. I mean, first of all, major congratulations on making such a cool website, because that's the kind of thing that, is such an inspiration for the next generation coming up and thinking, well, what am I going to do with my life? And as you say, like maybe really interested in science, but not super keen to jump into grad school, and also not keen to work for $10 an hour or volunteer their time forever and ever, because like in order to do something they like that actually gives value, right? That's the wonderful thing about the internet, is that we can uncover all of these really amazing opportunities and experiences for all levels of qualification. And I think that's also what's really special about citizen science, is that anybody can be involved. And certainly when I've been on ships working, the guests who show up to, for example, sit with Bob and do some readings of the salinity of the ocean and whatnot, you've got everything from 20-year-olds to 70-year-olds, that are super keen. And then they go home and they follow the project, and they're all kind of waiting as well to see what kind of results are going to come up from that. And it's always exciting when we spot a whale for the first time, and then like the HappyWhale project, depending on the gear and what's going on, will sometimes allow us to name that whale. And so, there's lots of really, really cool things that are coming out of this, but especially for women and girls, I think this is just great. And also because we're seeing the shift of more women coming in the earlier ranks, as you say, I wonder, and I'd be very curious to see if over time they start to get up into those higher level positions, because we're also seeing a shift in how women are deciding to run their careers, right? And not everybody is running out and like having kids as early or at all anymore.
Yeah.
There's a real sea change in what women are deciding to do with their lives. So I'll be super keen to see what's going on 20 years from now and how women are represented in science, and specifically in polar science, because it's obviously very close to both of our hearts.
Yes.
But we will post a link to your website in the show notes, of course, for anyone who's interested. I do have one more question for you.
Yeah.
So we know that you're an avid runner based on your biography, but is there a particular reason why you decided to run the Antarctic Marathon dressed as a banana?
It's definitely a highlight of my life. So the banana story comes in this trip I was taking in 2013 to go on the research icebreaker for 53 days. We had heard rumor that the treadmill was broken on board and you couldn't go more than 2 or 3 miles. And at this time in my life, I had only run one marathon before. It was a San Francisco Nike women's marathon. So me and another couple graduate students were deciding, we'll be on McMurdo Station for a couple of days, 5 days, while we wait for this icebreaker. And Scott Base, the New Zealand base, is only 5 kilometers away. Maybe we just do a fun run. We'll make it costume based and it just be something fun. Because another thing you start to realize when you work in the polar regions is you have to keep morale high quite often, especially on research ships, where your life is every day just taking samples. And so there's a lot of costume boxes floating around station and on board. And so we just brought our own costumes. And I had this banana costume from, past costume events and thought that would be perfect because it's lightweight, travels well. And somebody on station was like, oh, there's a marathon happening and you should run it. And I was like, well, when else will I ever get this chance? And why not spice it up with wearing the banana costume? Which actually turned out to be perfect because it was an extra layer, but also the end of the costume was like a pocket, so I could hold all these snacks inside of it.
I would have never imagined that, but it makes total sense.
And then, of course, you get the people running by just making banana jokes, like, don't slip on the peel.
That's amazing. And the costume didn't get in the way of you actually running. It wasn't cumbersome.
No, not at all.
That's amazing. I love it. Well, we're going to post a picture of this as well, because I've seen a picture of you in this banana costume with the snow in the background. We'll make sure that we get a picture up on the podcast page, but that's great. You're the first person. I've met people who have run the Antarctic Marathon before, but never someone who was dressed as a banana doing it. Oh, that's hilarious. All right. Is there any cause or project that you want to give a shout out to today that we can let listeners know about?
I definitely want to give a shout out to the polarcollective.org, or the group of enthusiastic polar guides that are trying to make a link between interested operators who want to find researchers, and then researchers who want to find operators who may not know how they can convert their research into an engaging project that could be done on the ships. So they're trying to make that to facilitate those interactions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We'll definitely link to that as well. Thank you so much for your time, Allison. I know this is all going to be very interesting for people who have not heard of citizen science before, and hopefully some folks who are planning on going down south will look for a trip that involves a citizen science project for them to be a part of. So thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And I hope listeners start to realize citizen science is a great way to enhance their travel experience.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. If you like the stories we bring to you, please subscribe for future episodes. And if you want to help the podcast, leaving a rating or review greatly assists us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, your experts in small ship expedition cruises to the Arctic and Antarctica. We love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.